Hi, this is Naomi with Sword and Steel, and today I'll be painting the Stormcast Eternals out of the Stormcast Eternals Paints Set for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, using only the paints provided in that set. As you'll see, I have difficulties. Here's our box of Stormcast Eternals and paints, and here's everything inside: 3 Stormcast Eternals, 6 paints, and a starter paintbrush. Now, let's look at the paints again to see what we have. First, we have Rakarth Flesh, and as you see, it needs to be mixed, as every paint has to be before you start using it. This is what it's supposed to look like. We've got Cantor Blue, a base, Recklin Flesh Shade, a wash, Abaddon Black, a very nice black, it's a base, Rhinox Hide, a very dark brown, and lastly Retributor Armor, which is a great golden yellow. And these Stormcast Eternals are push fit, and they are quite straightforward to put together. When you start assembling these, I'd suggest cutting off just the tops of each of these rods, so there's no chance that they are too long when you fit the pieces together. It would be a great pain to try and pull it apart to do after, so I do it to everyone beforehand. Or instead you could just glue all of the pieces together, in which case you could snip those parts off entirely. For this tutorial though, I didn't use any glue. I'd still suggest it, but I must say that through the entire painting process, there was no sign of them trying to come apart in my hands. So, thumbs up for that. Now that I've assembled them all, and we have all the pieces completed except for one alternative headpiece, let's have a look at what the others look like. These are beautifully sculpted models. You could certainly use them as a statue in a Dungeons and Dragons scene, don't you think? Really well done. Besides Sequitors for your Age of Sigmar games, these would make some pretty nice paladins, I gotta say. So the first one I'm painting will be in the color scheme the box suggests, and that starts with Retributor Armor right on the grey plastic. Most every Citadel base can go directly onto the grey plastic of the miniatures. However, I would suggest not doing that. It is much easier on you and also on your models if you use a spray primer or an airbrush to cover your models with paint first. It's easy to spray too much on your model though, so make sure you practice on anything that you can discard if it fails first time or second time around. Now, my paintbrush, the starter paintbrush from the kit, was way too small to try and take out enough paint so that I could paint an entire model up. So I just used a sprue. I gave it a shot. Normally I would take a larger paintbrush, a less quality one, for dipping paints out of a paint pot, but hey, I don't have that in this challenge, so there we go. Sprue in action. And finally I get to paint the miniature. Right now I'm feeling the consistency of the paint to see if I need to dilute it, but this one is actually pretty good right out of the bottle for basing. So I don't actually dilute the Retributor Armor at this stage. I'm using an up and down motion with my brush, making certain that as I move upwards, the paintbrush is sliding along the miniature, and as I move downwards, the paintbrush is sliding along the miniature. This is making a more even coat and spreading out the paint as far as it can go. And I'm only doing this in one layer if I haven't touched the paint in the past 2 seconds, that I won't be going back to it. If you do, you might just scrape the paint off accidentally since the paint hasn't dried properly. So make certain you only do this in one layer and don't go back over your work until your paint has dried fully. Now, this paintbrush is not the paintbrush for the task. It is too small. It's forcing me to grab too much paint so that I can actually get anywhere with it. on the model, I would absolutely suggest a larger paintbrush, just a bit larger, maybe 3 times the size perhaps, with soft bristles. If you get one that has really stiff bristles, you may miss the nooks and crannies. That one is for dry brushing, and that is what it's meant for. It's meant to miss the crevices when you're dry brushing in general. So you want one with a nice soft brush, and you may find you may want to water down the Retributor armor a little bit more with the larger brush. Alright, one layer has been applied. Now, whether this was over plastic or over your primer underneath, you can see that it's not perfectly applied. There are smudgy areas, I guess you could say. That is completely fine for one layer of paint. That will disappear as you put more layers over top. It's time to base the others. As you can see, I chose Abaddon Black for the base of this miniature. Really, I could have chosen any of the other colors besides the wash because they are all bases, but I went with Abaddon Black because a black primer underneath your first few colors really gives a shading without much effort. I did find that the Abaddon Black was slightly thicker than the Retributor armor, so I ended up watering it down to a 3:1 ratio of Abaddon Black to water. Similarly, I did a 3:1 ratio of Rakarth Flesh to water, and Rakarth Flesh was not quite as easy as the other two to provide a good basing. I have a feeling there's Corax White in the recipe, just a feeling. Nevertheless, though it does appear lumpy, don't be alarmed, it still works perfectly fine when mixed with water. Pale colors sometimes just don't seem to work out that well for Citadel. Alright, while that Rakarth Flesh one dries, I can return to this golden one. Time to put on the second coat. Now, I'll only be adding a second coat to the areas that will actually be gold as shown in the box instructions. And I'm adding a little water this time so it applies in a smooth, thinner coat over the other one. I didn't wait that long for the first layer to dry, so I don't want much friction over the still freshly dried paint. A more wet, slightly thinner layer works best. Can you see how the gold is immediately becoming brighter as the second coat is applied? Now, while that second coat is drying, I've decided to use Rhinox Hide on this black-based Sequitor. I'm really just winging the color scheme the entire time with these two other models, so I won't necessarily be painting in the order ideal for the color scheme I'm creating, but that's how it is when you're figuring it out. I decided to make the edges of his shoulder pads look leather, and since that seemed to look good, I thought maybe his cloak would also be brown. Let's give him a monk or Jedi kind of look to him. And since I really don't have a lot of options here in this kit for ground color, I might as well put the Rhinox Hide on the base of both this one and the gold miniature, since the gold miniature's box instructions told me to do so, which suits that gold miniature just fine, as you can see. And while that is drying, of course I'll be creating some more watered down Rakarth Flesh to apply as a second layer over this miniature. I haven't figured out what I'm going to be doing with it yet, so a second Rakarth Flesh layer it shall be. Next, I'll be working on the brown and black miniature again. Now, I really needed to add some sort of color, and since the only color I have, really, is the blue, that's the one I'm going to be adding. It took me a little bit of time to figure out where exactly I wanted all of this blue, but I decided let's do something a bit different and make all the metal blue. I could have made the metal gold, really that is the only metal that you have, so that would have been my only option, but I was like, nope, let's do this completely different and put blue anywhere I would normally put gold or silver. And while the blue was nice and fresh, I added all the blue in the areas where the box art requested it. And here we have all the blue parts done. As you can see, the layer isn't perfectly done. That's completely fine for the first layer. As soon as you put on a second layer, it'll brighten it up and come out nice and smooth. We don't want to put too much paint on at one time. And we'll leave that blue to dry before we do anything else on that miniature. Now we have the second coat of Rakarth flesh dry, and you know, kind of looks like a pretty good statue. At this point, I have no idea where I'm going with this, so I thought, well, gold is always pretty, so let's do an inverse shield. I think that looks pretty good, inverse to what the box art is. And then I was like, well, that lion there, that looks really good in gold. I mean, it definitely looks like it should be gold, so I'll do that. I really just fiddled around with the Retributor armor, putting it in places that I thought would look nice, until I ran out of places. I wanted to do something that was unique from the other ones, but I was struggling. This kit definitely wants you to follow the color scheme on the box. After checking the color scheme again on the box, I realized that I missed some of the black parts. In fact, his belt and his bracers of sorts were all supposed to be black. I just thought that they were blue because the picture on the box is not quite clear. But nope, black, and you can see that on the art for the Stormcast Eternals and the Hammers of Sigmar color scheme as well. So whoops, gotta get that black on. And of course, as that is drying, I'm moving on to another miniature. This time I am using a second coat of the Rhinox hide all over the first coat of brown that I have. I may skip over the underbelly at this point of any of the brown areas to give a bit more shadow and contrast, but for the most part I'm covering up all of the first layer of brown with the second layer. And because that's looking pretty great, I don't wait and I take out my Crag blue again and do the same thing with the blue. I put a second coat over all of the blue and you can see it start to brighten up right away. Again, I probably skip over a little bit of anything that is pointing downward, but for the most part I completely cover up the first layer with the second layer. And lo and behold, despite my worries, a color scheme does seem to be unfolding before our very eyes. Hopeful with my new color scheme in mind, I immediately go forth with some gold and put it in areas that seem to fit, like bling. And no, this paintbrush is not the best for painting small details, but I try. I really try. And you can fix it with more brown later, thankfully. So it's not a big mess. It's not terribly terrible. Now it's time to take my chunky, wonderfully chunky Rakarth flesh. And again, this chunk is fine. I'd be worried about it in perhaps darker paint, but in lighter paint for some reason it's a little bit chunky. As long as it smooths out a bit with water, you'll be fine. It'll work perfectly. It'll just look strange. As you can see, the Rakarth flesh does go on quite smoothly over the gold. And it's very opaque. That's one thing that the Rakarth flesh is very good at, covering. A true base in that. A lot of light colors don't cover well at all. So maybe mixing in a little bit of a Rakarth flesh to your non-covering paint would work well for you. Now we're going to try a blend. We're going to take some Rakarth flesh and we're going to take some of the Rhinox hide and make a highlight for our original Rhinox hide cloak. However, this really isn't the color for it. I'm going to try it, but I'm a little bit dubious because you really want something a little bit more reddish to highlight this brown. As you see, I'm grabbing any areas that are facing upward. And this is going to look pretty harsh at first, but I will be making a mid color to even it all out. Really, I'm testing on whether this Rakar's flesh and Rhinox hide mix could even work as a highlight. It might just be a bit too grey for realism. So yes, after applying a bit to test it out, I go back, I make some watery Rhinox hide and recover the areas that I put that Rakar's flesh mix on, but because it's Rakar's flesh is underneath it instead of brown, it actually brings out the color of the brown, which works well. After I've placed it in areas I think that will suit, I go ahead and make a medium brown using Retributed Armor, believe it or not, seeing as that's the only golden brown I have a source of. More of the Rhinox hide and less of the Rakar's flesh. And with this mid-brown, I highlight the rest of all the different brown areas. I realize that the color really is off, but I've already made the decision to highlight each of the edges with this mid-brown, and then after I'm done highlighting it, I'm going to go ahead and wash it all with the Recklin Flesh Shade, and it should do two things. It should blend all of the colors together so that the highlights won't be so harsh, and it should make the brown highlights that are now grayish more reddish in hue. But of course I can't do that until all my layer paint is dry, so I move on to shade this fellow first. As you can see, I'm going to use it right out of the bottle, just as it is, once I've shaken it up of course, and I will apply this all over the miniature. That is because the box tells me to do so. I do not think this is the right color for the Rakar's flesh cloth, or the blue, really. Now, really, I think I should have done a second layer of blue over top, particularly on his cloth, before I did this Recklin Flesh Shade, but really, this brownish red wash was not, I don't think, the best choice for over blue and over the cloth, but that's what they wanted, so that's what I'm doing. It does, however, go fantastic over the Retributor armor. Must say, Recklin Flesh Shade over the Retributor armor looked great. It also looked great over the brown, if that makes sense. A reddish brown, over brown, just works. Over blue, no. Over grey cloth, no. But okay. I'm catching pools here, by the way, and that's a pretty important step. You have to do it while the wash is still quite wet. You just get your damp brush, like I'm doing, and pull it off the miniature. You don't want big old pools, because the big old pool will end up looking like a dried pool, and that's not exactly the look that I'm going for. Now, I decided before I applied the Recklin Flesh Shade over top my blue-brown miniature, I was going to give it another try in making a highlight that would match the Rhinox hide out of the paints that was provided. So I grabbed some Rakar flesh with the Recklin Flesh Shade itself, and was like, okay, maybe I can make a reddish brown out of these two. It became a quite liquidy reddish brown, which is just fine for highlighting. Now, this is going to look out of place and too bright, but that is fine still, because I am planning on putting a wash over top of it. And when you put a wash over top, like I said before, it's going to smooth out the color transitions. It's like a cheat. You can do a terrible highlight job, put a wash over top of it, and it's like it works out perfectly, as long as you have the highlights in the right place. I'm also grabbing some of the Macragge blue and the Rakar flesh, mixing it together. Again, not the perfect combination, But it does become a slightly greener blue, so that works well for me. Your highlight color should be a little bit more greenish blue than the original blue. So to achieve the result I want, I just keep mixing blue with Rakkar Flesh, and I come up with a lighter highlight, a medium highlight, and the Macragge blue itself. It's not satisfactory yet, but I'm going to leave that there and come back to it with fresh eyes. And move on to this one. Now, I did like the mid-tone mix of the Rakkar Flesh with the Macragge blue, so that is what I'm going to apply to this miniature. I mean, I really like it just as is, but I decided probably does not look complete with just 2 colors on it. So I daringly go ahead and add the blue after I figure out exactly where I want the blue, which is really hard because I like the look of it just as it is. But I gotta do it. I'd much prefer to use a different color. Maybe red. I think red would look really nice here, but I don't have red. So I must persevere and touch my pretty painting with something I don't necessarily want to put on it. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And much like I did with the blue-brown guy, before that first blue layer finishes drying, I move on to start highlighting, just in a wet blending kind of fashion. I just added a bit more Rakkar Flesh to the Macragge Rakkar Flesh mix to get a lighter value, and just placed a highlight anywhere that I thought would suit, which is in the raised areas that tend to be looking up more than down, until she looks like that, which is actually pretty good looking, I think. The next thing I'm going to do with her is I'm going to add some Rakkar Flesh to the stone at her feet to give some more contrast to the coloring of the miniatures, and then I'll leave her to dry. And at this point, the brown blue fellow will be dry enough for me to put the Recklin Flesh shade all over the brown. I'm not going to be putting the Recklin Flesh shade over the blue because that would be silly, but I will be putting it all over the brown to blend that highlight and the shadows all together. It was also added over the gold as well, and too early to tell, but I think it will turn out great. Now I've waited for them all to dry, and we'll have a look. So we've got this one. All of his wash is dried. He is ready. Oh, right. So this would be if you had put a second layer of blue underneath that. This would be where the box tells you to stop. And we're not going to stop there. We're going to give him some highlights. Though I do need to fix that mid-riff because that apparently is supposed to be black. But yes, if I had put 2 layers of the blue, that would be where you'd stop. This is how my makeshift one looks like now that the ground is dried. And you can tell what Retributor armor looks like when you don't put a wash over it versus what you do, and I definitely like how the Recklin Flesh shade goes over the Retributor armor. I think it brings a very nice golden hue to it. And as you see, all of my highlights are more blended in. I still need a bit of work. I'm going to create a brown that will blend this more together, but it's towards the color that I was looking for when it came to the highlight. A more reddish brown than grayish brown, so I'm content where I am now with that one. So the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to highlight all of the different things. We're going to highlight the gold, we're going to highlight the Rakkar Flesh, and we're going to highlight the Macragge blue, all with their original colors. Starting, not with that, that's for my nails. Starting with Retributor armor. So I'm just highlighting anything that really has a sharp line to it, or just needs a little bit of extra attention big round sections and edges. And I want to make certain that I keep the Recklin flesh shade visible in all of the crevices and areas that are basically facing down. I'm also fixing up any mistakes that I made, like how I put that blue over top and the tiny little buttons that I see that are supposed to be gold. Doing it conservatively to start, because it looks really good as is, so I don't want to ruin the pretty effect it has. So I definitely don't want to overdo adding Retributor armor back to it. Something like that. And the Recklin flesh shade is still present in most locations, just accented it a little bit here and there. And I'm going to do the same with a little tiny bit of gold here, which is going to be very quick. Basically the tops of the bigger pieces, and making that vial look a little bit more accentuated. And I realized that I think I need a little bit more than just what's there, so I go ahead and start adding more gold accents anywhere that I think would benefit the model in its look. Now this is hard to do, I've got to say, with this brush, but I try. After I'm done, I can just fix it back up with more brown, since I'm not done the shading of the brown quite yet. And that's about where I'll leave that. Come back to it with fresh eyes. When you're creating a paint scheme that you really don't know how you're going to finish it with, it's nice to leave it for a little bit and then come back to it with fresh eyes, as if you weren't the one who originally painted it. Now I have to figure out something to do with this fellow, and I have no idea at this point. Don't have a clue. I've run out of paint to make it look different. I know I need to do something, don't know what it is, so I decided to go with the easy way, the easy way, and start adding some more details to its base, because I know how I can improve the base. So I just mix up a watery amount of Recklin flesh shade with Rhinox hide and start shadowing the base, the rocks of the base, and after that I add a bit of Abaddon Black to the mix, so that we've got a Recklin flesh shade, Rhinox hide, Abaddon Black mix, and do a bit more shading in the deeper crevices. And then I added a dash of Retributor armor to give it a bit of a golden hue, and I put it all over the original Retributor armor. I thought it might give it a nice aged metal effect, because it's so watery it'll act like wash, but it has black in it, so that it should be a more aged looking metal than just the Recklin flesh shade alone. Really, this was just experimentation, but this is what it looks like when all of the metal is covered. I also use this mix directly over the Rakarth flesh on the belt and on the vial at her hip, just to give them a different look. And something inspired me when I was doing this to make me think that the end of her hammer needed a dark color. I didn't want to go black because that would just be a little bit unrealistic. So I decided to go brown because that's much more realistic. I think it worked. I do. And now to complement the brown now on her blade, I immediately watered down the Rhinox hide I used to darken up the stone under her feet, kind of like in a cobblestone fashion, keeping some parts light here and making some parts dark there. I think it worked well, and after that all dries, I'm sure I'll put on put a dry brush over something. I don't know how I'm going to do that dry brush effect because I don't have the color that I know that I want, so I'm probably going to have to make it with Rakarth flesh and Retributor armor. That's what I got. The mixes that you can create when you've got nothing else. What is it they say? Necessity is the mother of all inventions. Alright, as that dries, I water down some Macragge Blue to apply the first highlight over the darkened Macragge Blue on our box art Sequitor. And I do not cover everything up. So in the crevices, in areas that I think should look dark and a little bit more dingier because of shadow, I keep the new Macragge Blue off of it. But for the most part, it's covering up the first layer of the Macragge Blue. And then, after that Macragge Blue is done, I go ahead and do basically the same sort of thing with Rakarth Flesh this time, highlighting raised areas, keeping some of that reddish tone from the Recklin Flesh shade revealed. I do not think this was the wash for Rakarth Flesh. I do not feel that it matches very well as a shadow to Rakarth Flesh, but hey, that's what we got. That's what it wants you to do, so that's what I've got to stick with. One thing's for certain, you do have to take your time with highlighting. Basically, you conservatively highlight more and more and get it up to the point that you like, rather than going full tilt right from the beginning. Once that step is done, I remember that I need to fix up the black that I put onto the miniature, as well as finally paint the black on his armor pieces as well. Which I do think looks much better. Yeah, it did start completing the look there. When that's done, I think we could use some highlights. So I add a bit of Rakarth Flesh because that's my only way of lighting it up. The Macragge Blue, add a little bit of Rakarth Flesh to the Macragge Blue, and I go ahead with some highlights. Now this one, this mix, it's much more Macragge Blue than Rakarth Flesh, so that when it dries, it's a more subtle highlighting effect. I don't want to be stark because I'm not putting anything over it. Really, I'd really like to have a nice black or blue wash at this point. That would be great, but I don't have it. So I'm just going to be gentle with the highlighting on this one, and it'll be much less visible when it dries. I don't know if I've said this before, but there's something really soothing about highlighting. I don't know, maybe because you're at the end of the road, maybe because it just makes an improvement and gives you a lot of satisfaction. Okay, highlight number 1 done. Next step is to do a little bit more of a bold highlighting with more Rakarth Flesh in with the Macragge Blue, but this highlighting I'm going to be very careful not to overdo it. Hopefully. My brush might want me to overdo it, but I'm going to try to not do that. I think it might be best if you see all of the highlighting that I do here, just so you know that even though I touch in sections all over the miniature, I do it very conservatively. Again, a highlight shouldn't cover the whole area. It should just cover where it, it looks best. Just don't overdo the last highlight. It kind of ruins the previous ones, I think. Oh, and did you know that your finger is actually a tool? Very useful one. Don't be afraid to use it. I mean, I might use it too much sometimes, but it works, so. Yep, I like my highlighting. Oh boy. Have to make certain that The paint is very wet though for this last highlighting, because you're using the side of your brush at the same time as you're using the tip, more often the side, and you really need to make certain that that is super liquidy for that to work. Now you see that might look a bit extreme right now, but it's going to blend in when it dries. I don't know, I like it anyway. Let me know what you think of my highlighting. It was fun. If nothing else, it was fun to do. Now, as I said I would, I'm coming back to my blue-brown miniature to fix up his highlights just using watered down Rhinox hide. Watered down Rhinox hide is going to allow me to blend in all of the areas that just don't work that well, and make that highlight that I accentuated too much a little bit more subtle. I didn't actually change much, it turned out. I was happy with most everything, just tidied it up, made certain if I had accidentally got gold on any of the brown, I'd fix that up, and that's it. Now it's a new day, and I can look at all these guys with new eyes. Right, first things first, I realized that his hammer's handle had to have Rakar's flesh on it. I missed that the first time around, so I added Rakar's flesh, and we'll put over top Reckland flesh shade. But besides that, he's mostly done. Just need to finish up his base and maybe clean up any little itty bitty bits I didn't notice the first time around, like that. And that's it. He's basically finite, which is fantastic. He's looking good. I'm pretty satisfied with him. And actually, I'm pretty satisfied with this fellow too. I think I might need to work a little bit more on the blues. I'm pretty good with his little brown cloak. Probably have to fix up the... yeah, I have to fix up the blues around his shoulder pads a bit. And I'll do that. And maybe fix up the gold, just to make certain everything's a little bit neater, and I'll probably dry brush a little bit of stuff over his base. But otherwise done. This fellow, I'm still not satisfied with this fellow. I feel like I need to extend my color palette to finish this one, but I'm going to try to be satisfied with it. I mean, it's close, but it's just missing something. So I have to figure out what that is, using what I have available, of course. The rocks underneath are looking pretty good though, yeah. I think so. As I said, Reckland Flesh Shade is gonna have to go over this very gently. Put it on and then take off any excess. Is generally how I like to do it. Controlled mesh. That's wash, a controlled mess. So I'm taking Rhinox hide and creating some sort of highlight color for his base. Now it's not gonna be perfect because we don't got the colors for it. I really want a reddish brown. Actually, in the painted tools, the Mornfane brown would probably work great for that. But I don't have that, so I'm going to attempt to make a more reddish brown with Retributor armor. The metal aspect of Retributor armor will disappear once it's mixed into the Rhinox hide. I mean, it'll still be there mildly, not very much. This seems still a bit too dark, so I'm going to add some Rakar's flesh to the mix as well to try and find something that seems like a reasonable color to lay over those rocks. And look, I actually made the color that looks very close to what Mournfang Brown does. Though it's looking a little bit too brown on the paper towel, I have realized. I'm gonna give it a shot anyway. I think Mournfang Brown would have worked out much better. And I just, you know, fiddle with it. Put it on there kind of haphazardly. This brush is not meant for dry brushing, but I give it a go. It does fine. The fact that I have leaves down on there is kind of bothering me, so I think maybe, just maybe, I could create a green with a crag blue and retributor armor. And I'll try. And, you know, it's greenish. It's better than brown. Not perfect. Add a little bit more retributor armor to it. A little bit of highlight. I mean, it's not the best, but it's green. Now these last few steps are just cleanup, really. I added Recklin Flesh Shade to this brown one's gold so that had more accents of shadows versus light. I added Recklin Flesh Shade to this one's comb because I needed to do something with it. And as well, I decided to water down Abaddon Black and Rakarth Flesh mix to add some depth to this person's cloak. I really wanted to brighten up the cloak, but I couldn't really do that because the Rakarth Flesh was as bright as it could go, so I decided to very carefully darken its crevices, which in turn will brighten up, will make it look brighter anyway. I couldn't do much, I think, but I enjoyed it better than what it was before. And I dry brushed the bases with various makeups of Rhinox hide and Rakarth flesh and Recklin Flesh Shade mixtures. And finally, I applied black all around their base. Sometimes I like to extend their base down to the very bottom, but where that isn't possible here, I figure a nice black rim is much nicer looking. Make it look nice and fancy. And that's that. I'm pretty satisfied with how they all turned out. Not completely satisfied with the non-color scheme ones, just because I felt so restricted on the colors I want that I used. I think I took them as far as I could go. Do let me know which one you liked the best, what you didn't like, what you liked, what you thought. Was it helpful to you? All that lovely news in the comments below. Oh, and I didn't even mention I added black to the shield after, just to try and change it up. Well, I hope you enjoyed. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I must reiterate that I think it would be, unless of course you're going ahead and getting this and you want to stick to the color scheme, of course. As you can see, the color scheme actually worked great. But if you want more of a variety for painting your miniatures and don't want to feel restricted like I did, then I would suggest getting the Paint and Tools set with some more Sequitors, a bigger box of Sequitors. You're going to need them anyway if you're going to join into Stormcast Eternals. So the Paint and Tools set, which has everything that you need in there, plus white and red and more colors. It's lovely. In comparison to the 6 colors that you start off with. I'm showing you how far you can go, but I still think that you should go with the Paint and Tool set. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It helps me a lot, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye! Oh my goodness, I don't want to paint with that paint set anymore. I don't like. I like my paints. I like my paint variety. It was a good experiment. Let's not do that again, though.